right. Well, welcome back, everybody, to another Future of Church, where we are exploring the landscape of faith, technology, culture, all sorts of things. And I am Christopher.
And I'm Joe.
Oh, look at that. We are getting it. Episode 5, and we are nailing the intro. For those of you who are watching or listening, I know we've had a recent uptick in people tuning into this. So if you have not, give it a review or a rating to help people find this, because hopefully if you've listened to it, you found it helpful. And that just helps other people find it. But just a parental advisory for today's conversation. Because today last week, if you didn't catch it, we talked about kind of how Christians can be thinking about artificial intelligence. But as we move forward, we want to go a little bit deeper into that, into specific areas. And today we're going to be talking about how we can be thinking about the rising challenges that we're going to be facing as artificial intelligence changes sexual temptation on a wildly different scale than I think many people are anticipating. So if you have young ears in the room, you might want to put in headphones or other things like that. We're not going to be explicit. We're not going to say anything, just, for the sake of being explicit. But the topic is probably not for young ears. Is that a fair assessment, Joe?
I think so. And I would also add in to be a little bit of cautious. If you know that sexual temptation is something that you struggle deeply with, and one of the protective hedges you might have is just not knowing where to go find it.
It's true.
You might want to have somebody else pre-screen this one for you, just so that you don't end up having new ideas of where you can go and struggle in this area. I know there's
I actually think it's a really good call out. It's a really good call out.
Yeah.
And I actually kind of wrestled with that a little bit when we were discussing this topic, because I was like, the last thing I want to do is we have this conversation and somebody goes, well, I didn't know I could do that. And then it actually
right
sends them down a path. So the goal of this is not to tell you what's coming or what's possible so that you can play around with it. Because in my opinion, you are playing with fire. And this is not something I think anybody should be messing with.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And it's something that it is anytime like a new avenue pops up in front of me, I'm always like a little bit devastated inside. It's kind of an oxymoron, a little bit devastated. Because now I'm like, okay, great. Now I have to worry about that.
Right. Well, and again, our goal with this is to help people understand where this is going, because my experience, and I'm curious your take on this, Joe, but when I have conversations about this, a lot of times the reaction can sometimes be almost a bit shock, a little like, what? No, like we wouldn't go that far with it. And I think it's one of those things where oftentimes when we think about technology advancing in this, it kind of goes to this dystopian. I mean, I was on Theology in the Raw, and we talked about, where sex robots could go. And it sounds like just such an extreme far end of it. But like so many things, that's not where you start. But I think as we look at where technology is going, I don't think it's a far stretch to think that this could be a real challenge for Christians in the modern age, in the not so distant future.
Yeah, and I would say it's similar in the conversations I've had where you have either what you're talking about, where it's like, what, that's not even appealing. Like, why would we do that? How would we actually get there? To the other end, where it's, there's also an extreme end where it's absolute fear. Like, how do I avoid this? And how do I, as both of us, as having boys that we're trying to raise,
and being men, so we've got that, we've got our own experiences,
right? Well, it's a little terrifying to think about. Okay, if I'm supposed to be guiding and protecting, shepherding, discipling, all of these things, and and that's a lot, and my scope of control is this, and I know that I have failed in these areas, how do I pass on that in a way that is helpful to my kids? And and this is where I think the understanding, even if your brain defaults to, that sounds absurd. Why would anyone do that? That you
Yeah.
still would be well, do yourself and the people around you well to know about it. Um, Not so you can like lock down and be paranoid, but so that you can say, hey, let's really think about this. Let's
Yeah.
through the filters of our faith and what God has to say. Because even as I was preparing for this one, people who have listened to multiple episodes know we're not doing a lot of deep theological grinding,
Mm-mm.
in here. But as I'm thinking about it, one of the things that was of an extreme comfort to me, um, is, we'll talk a little bit about the image of God and how that plays into our response to this. But just that idea that God has been here from the beginning. So
Yeah.
he's seen everything. He's walked with everyone through all of these things.
Yep.
And our sermon series at church right now is in the book of Daniel. We're in the prophetic chapters. And so remembering that, and he's going to be here all the way until the end. Like, we don't have an outdated God who's going
No,
to
we don't.
suddenly lose touch of what's going on in our world, as we go. And so I just, in my mind, I'm framing this conversation for myself and maybe for others as, God isn't just the bookends, he's all the books in between.
Yep.
And we can rely on him and his spirit to help us wrestle through these things,
Yeah.
should we choose to wrestle and not either lay down or and give up, or just headbutt against it, like trying
Yep.
to break down a brick wall. um it's tough, and it's not, for all the things that we can look at and say, well, this is black and white, like the way you handle it, there, that isn't the owner's manual written out in that specificity. Say these words
No.
to your children. um and
Well,
and
I
I,
think on that topic, one of the things I would add to this that I think is really important is this is often an area that's super uncomfortable for people to talk about in general too. And
yeah,
there can almost be in Christian circles this like, you gross. And it's like, well, no, I mean, it was designed by God for our good, but it's one of those things that Satan has this way of
yeah,
twisting and just slightly manipulating this stuff. And so that's where at least in my background and just in experiences I've seen with others, like that tends to be where he finds his way in, is
yeah,
through a good channel, what can seem good, and then all of a sudden things start to go sideways. And I think that's, to me, one of the biggest dangers of these advanced technologies is they can very much present themselves not in what you're expecting it to be, but can slowly, warm up the water to the point where that's where you find yourself.
yeah. No, that's very true. And the other one, and I think after this we probably need to get out of disclaimer and framing mode. But
Yeah.
the last thing I wanted to add in is just acknowledgement. We talked about having sons and us ourselves being men. I do think that's an important thing to, like, little pause call out, is that we can't speak from the perspective of women
No.
who might hear this and be engaging, because that's is a demographic that exists in terms of
Correct.
consuming and of course creating content like this. Um and all along the spectrum of, this is something I choose to do, this is something I'm forced to do, this is something that is exploitative by definition and not, and more women are also consuming it all the time. And so we want to make sure that we say that up front. We are very much speaking from our perspectives. And I know you always put out a shout for emailing thoughts and comments, and
Yeah.
particularly if any women are listening to this and say, yeah, here's what it's like for me or us or wherever that spectrum is. We'd be interested in hearing some of that. And
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that's just so again, we will get out of the disclaimers and context setting. But really, as we were planning for this, the discussion was not to be like, here's how it is for guys. Like this is the
mhm,
guys conversation about, but more talking about the trajectory that things are on just
Right.
overall. But while at the same time recognizing we are coming at this from the perspective of two guys talking about it and recognizing our own limitations on things like that. And we may be like, I mean, this is how we're seeing it, but we're inevitably going to be missing details.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay. So I'm actually curious when you think about it, because I'm at the forefront of this stuff. And I don't mean at the forefront as in I'm toying around with a lot of things we're talking about. In fact, I go out of my way to make sure I steer clear of the waters, but I'm much more familiar with the tech, how it works, how it's being subtly used and twisted in different things, and the potential use cases it could go. I'm curious from your vantage point, what are some of the things that you see or that you've maybe heard about that maybe have raised your eyebrows and gone, oh, that feels like it might be something new?
Yeah, I think it's really in when the large language models really started coming out, and and people started engaging with those. It was almost like my big aha moment, or oh shoot, I didn't even think about that, is when I started getting ads for apps that different variations of, hey, your AI girlfriend, and you're like,
Okay.
oh. And first thought is, okay, chatbot type stuff. And then you
Yep.
start seeing ads that remind you, oh yeah, these things do image manipulation. So not only that, but you can describe, and then they'll give you an image that matches your desires and expectations, that then talks to you the way you want to be spoken to. And you start thinking, oh man, as much as I'm scared of real people being credited with things they did or didn't say through these technologies, the implications on ways that people get sucked into their own little world of their own devising,
Of their own making.
yeah, is really like that's where, in that spectrum of can you see the appeal, is like, I don't know, like I can definitely see the appeal. And
Yeah.
I hadn't even given a single thought to, you talking about sex bots, because I'm just like swimming in this layer of like, there's so much wish fulfillment already that's possible through a screen that's in my pocket.
Yep.
And then you think, oh my goodness, there's actually industries for other things where technology is also growing. And you put the two of those together, and that it kind of sits there. But the other place that ties in terms of just kind of the march of technology, is I had a conversation a while ago with someone who's younger than me, who we were talking about the nature of temptation, and I said, you know what, one of my measuring sticks for a long time was, as long as I'm not trying to get it on my phone,
Okay.
I know I haven't hit rock bottom, because
Okay.
the phone was the less comfortable technology. I use it for, different things, but I didn't play a lot of games on it, whatever. And his response to me, because he grew up more with the cell phone than a computer, he said, oh, that's the exact opposite for me. Like, of course, the phone's the default. If I find myself being drawn towards a computer to sit down and, you're making time, you're doing this, like, that's when I know that I'm kind of approaching rock bottom. And
Okay.
so, thinking about it in those terms, I may be thinking, okay, this is scary technology. Um, but I certainly wouldn't go there. And if I do, whew,
Yeah.
that's a bridge too far. Someone who grows up swimming in it, where like AI models for collaboration, for work, for school, for just daily stuff, that's your norm, is interacting with um, these types of technology elements. That's going to be their default, to say, well, this is
Yeah.
the easy stuff. If I go to site X, Y, or Z to go look for something, that I didn't come up with, that's when I know I'm like, it's it's the
I think
technology trick.
I think the dehumanizing nature of it is actually probably one of the most concerning to
Yeah.
me as I've seen it, because as soon as generative AI really started going on the main stage, the second I saw the models get to a certain stage of maturity, I was like, this is going to create sexual temptation on a level that
Mm-hmm.
is so personalized and so disconnected from reality that it's going to put people in a state of cognitive disbelief that it just will, it's going to mess with people's psyches, because it's playing kind of like what we said in the intro. It's playing on things that are good. Like we want
Mm-hmm.
intimacy with someone, but now all of a sudden it's not a conscious being you're being intimate with. It's a
Yeah.
thing that just giving you what you want. God designed us in his image to create. And so an AI that can create, whether it's text or image or now video, very soon and already 3D environments, it's a good thing, but it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
take much to twist it. And all of a sudden it's like, well,
Yeah.
whoa. And now it becomes, to your point, so embedded into every aspect of your life. It doesn't, whether you're the person with the phone or your computer or what your watch, like
Mm-hmm.
it's everywhere, or
Yeah.
it can be.
Yeah. And talking about the depersonalization, and I don't think we talked about this, but I think it's one of the reasons you tend to get strong reactions when you talk about like virtual community in the church
Yeah.
is, you go from people being together in a room face to face, you know, all the things that go along with that, being able to touch, feel, hug, get close, lay hands on, all of that stuff. And you start saying, okay, now we're virtual. Okay, we're still face to face. We can still hear, we can still communicate, but I can't touch and feel. We can't, things like that. And you don't get quite the sense of being in a space with a lot of people where there's kind of noise in the background and
Yeah.
you're going through and making connections in that way. And then you go from there to and this is where you get into a slippery slope argument, which I'm a person who hates those. So
I do too.
so don't hear me as saying this is the end of the thing, but it's something to be conscious of. You look at that and then you go to social media where now it's just text on a website and you're like, who's that person? I don't know. That's is
Right.
and we start
But
forgetting
we
that we're
believe, but it
talking to a
taps into our psyche
person.
where it's like, but I have a
Yeah.
relationship with them. You have a
Yeah.
relationship, but really you don't, because you may
Right.
never have even
And then
actually interacted with that
right.
person.
And then for people that you don't have a relationship with, you may just other them, to use that in its verb form that's so popular now, without even necessarily thinking about it, because you don't even have a face for the person really.
Correct.
And and now you're becoming hostile towards people you don't even know because you don't have that. And then you go into, okay, I'm not interacting with people anymore, I'm going to interact with a large language model, and they're going to be the my sounding board for things. And and
And they are trained to give you exactly what
right,
you want.
you can create your own echo chamber there without having to rely on other people to be your echo chamber. And now you're so many steps removed from intimacy that even if you're just even if that's a very small percentage of people. And this is where I mentioned that the being made in the image of God and remembering that other people are as well, and what that means. Like, we really need to be careful that a slippery slope argument doesn't become an actual slippery slope for a person.
Correct.
And we need to be that much more vigilant about the people who are kind of dropping off the radar. Like, hey, we haven't seen you around for a while. We haven't heard from you. Are you okay? Because because when we talked about virtual community last time, you know, we spent some time affirming that Hebrews 10 concept of being gathered, of encouraging one another to good works, to doing those things. And it's becoming so much easier to hide.
Yep.
And to slip into these spaces and to become convinced that you cannot experience intimacy with anyone in general, perhaps, let alone if you are a person who like desires and seeks that, a marriage relationship, or even forgetting the Christian construct of marriage, just intimacy in
Yep.
general. That you say, okay, well, I can at least fake it and feel like it by engaging with these more and more and more immersive technologies. Um, and I feel like we have a great risk of losing people, and not necessarily talking about losing them from the faith or this and that, but just losing people. Like, where'd they
Yeah.
go? Who are
Well,
they with?
and I think going back to the sexual temptation side of this, it's feeding into some of that where it's
Yeah,
giving you some of that what you want in what seems like there's no risk to it. I mean, I think that's
right.
what's been so destructive about pornography and its rampant onslaught was the fact that there used to be a lot more that went into. I mean, I even think back to when we were kids before the internet. It wasn't something that was so ubiquitous. There was something that had to go into the game, whether it was, you went to a friend's house or, whatever their dad. I mean, I grew up in a small town. Somebody's dad would have this or that or whatever.
Hmm.
And then as the internet kind of made it much more accessible,
Yeah,
suddenly it was like, well, now it's lower risk to your point of being able to hide and let this stuff kind of seep in and nobody has to know. I'm not hurting anyone, at least in the definition of how I'm justifying it in my head of, well, I mean, nobody's getting hurt. You take that now to another level where it's like, well, hey, this isn't even really a person.
yeah.
So who's getting hurt? Nobody's getting
Hmm.
hurt. I'm just messing around. I'm just whatever. And I think it's extremely dangerous. But to your point, you can't just run from it and say,
Right.
well, I'm just going to run into the hills. Cause it's like, well, it's here.
Yeah. Yeah, and to wrap it around to my original, how I ended up going down that chain of thought, is that idea that when we talk about people being made in the image of God, and the Godhead being a example in that sense to us of community and accountability, and in relationship in that way, is that part of recognizing the image of God in ourselves and in others is gravitating towards that community, and whether that's in a reconciliation sense or just a encouraging and spurring on to good works, as we already mentioned. When you isolate yourself, some of the harm that is being done is in, you are consciously or not, and this is my opinion, I'd probably have to do a lot more research and write a couple papers but like, you're rejecting the image of God. You're saying I
Yeah.
can be
I can
whole
do this in isolation.
on my own. And so, yeah, maybe you're not inflicting harm on a person directly or indirectly by denying the image of God in them and taking advantage of how they've presented themselves or other people has presented them, as the case may be. You're denying it in a much more, in some ways passive, but in a different way, by saying, I don't need others because I have this.
Right.
Um, and but I'd be lying if I didn't say that I could see the attraction of it, because it feels safe. It feels
It
like,
does.
okay, I can't be hurt here, and I'm not hurting other people here. Uh,
And I'm getting exactly what I want.
right. Yeah. Or at least a close enough exit, or at least as much as I believe I can have,
Right. Well, and
as
I
the
think
case
that's where
may
the
be.
advanced technology is only going to push that
Right.
boundary further and further and further.
Yeah.
Is where it's like, well, this is as far as it can go. But again, where sometimes I get the sideways looks on this because I talk about it quite a bit, and it's people are like, I can't believe you're talking about this. But it's one of those things where there are studies coming out where there there are tools out there, and again, they aren't used for nefarious purposes like we're talking about. They're intended for good purposes, where you can create and you can look these up for like elderly people or people in nursing homes. You can create this little like Alexa type of a thing, but basically to start having a conversation with, because it's for people who are in a more isolated environment and they don't have people to converse with. But what they're finding is people start to, because they start engaging with it, they start to form a relationship and form a bond with this non-conscious being that, again, you just I mean, I just even think about relationship dynamics.
Right.
Most people, the person they ended up marrying, you didn't like start super intimate right out of the gate, or hopefully not, right? You normally it started as like, well, we start talking, and well, then we start talking a little bit more, and then we get to know each other a little bit further, and then all of a sudden, before you know it, you've become closer and closer and closer to a point where you do have to start challenging yourself to go, hey, whoa, like, where are the boundary lines here? And the thing is AI is never going to, it's never going to draw that boundary line.
No.
It's never going to say, hey, whoa. And I know people, this is where sometimes the pushback I get is, oh no, the AI models have these guardrails in place. And I'm like, first of all, one, they're ridiculously easy to jailbreak. And this is the disclaimer part. Like, so don't go trying it and then say, Christopher and Joe said you should, but they're very easy to jailbreak. And all it takes is one person to create their own that doesn't have those same safeguards, which with the money in that industry, it is not hard to imagine, oh, they could spin up their own. Yeah, they absolutely could, and remove those guardrails. And AI is never going to go, hey, hang on a second. I think we've crossed a line here. Let's back this up. It's not, because it's going to give you what you want.
Yeah. And the other place where, in terms of as it progresses, like, so I talked about the image of God and the harm that it can do there. The other place is continuing to erode the notion of sex as sacred. There was my wife.
Oh, it commoditizes it totally.
Yeah. Well, and my wife likes to point out periodically, of all the things that, Paul and other writers in the New Testament have to say to this audience or that audience, one of the very consistent things is about is notes on like sexual purity. Like this is a sacred thing to God, and should be for us as well as followers of him. And the more society cheapens it and then we follow along with it, the further we drag it out. And I know some of it's reactionary, from the very, puritanical, like, oh, we can't even talk about it. It's so sacred that it's secret. And, and it's actually because it brings us pleasure. It's so a part of the body that, as spiritual beings, it's just kind of a,
well, and that's what I was getting at before. We're like,
great.
In Christian culture, it's kind of like, ew, gross. Like we should just kind of like try and downplay and avoid this. And it only plays a role in things where we have to, and whatever.
And so there's that end of it. And in reaction to that, and partially in reaction to that, we see the other way. And now we're in this place where, as you look through history and, and what we take as society as appropriate sexual behavior, there's things that happen that, from a technology perspective, that enables us to interact with sex differently. And I'll just leave it there, because where we're at now, when we're talking about technology and AI and the possibilities, we're talking about more changes that technology brings for how we can interact with the topic of sex, and how we deal with that as individuals and as a church. And so as things become less sacred, as lives are enabled to become more isolated, and and all of that, you get a lot of, we want the kingdom without the king type of mentality. We want we want pleasure without any restriction whatsoever. And when we break sex down from, the full transition from sex is you gross, why, the body is icky, and we're spiritual beings, all the way over to, what, I can have what I want, it doesn't
Yep.
matter, because in
We can
both
dehumanize it to
extremes
a
sex
point.
is
It's
no
just a
longer
thing.
sacred. It's
Yep.
just a thing that
Yeah.
happens. And if we can't at least start inside the church, um, as Christians and Christ followers, to say, no, we need to treat this as sacred, we can't even show the world that this is a better way.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, if, because I know there's people, everyone probably knows that there's people, at least in the United States, because you see how people act in politics and whatever, that, you know, I think that a return to, I'll put that in quotes, a return to Christian ethics in our legal system will draw more people to God. Well, no, it might force them to act in a certain way. But if we really want to see the Christian ethic implanted on our society in good and fruitful ways, we need to make sure that what we're saying is right, is how we are also behaving, and that we're fully embracing it. Because we like
Yeah.
to talk about marriages and marriages being strong and marriages defined in a very specific
Well, I
way.
think on that one, I think we've idolized marriage in many
Right.
regards, where it's like
And
the apex of human existence, which I think has actually contributed to a lot of this stuff.
right, and by focusing so much on there without, looking at, and I know this is a very tired argument, so anyone who's hearing this and rolling their eyes, I forgive you. Um, the fact that our divorce rates in the church mirror the divorce rates overall, tells me that for all our rhetoric, we're not there. And I think one of the reasons for that in this part is pure speculation, but I think it's hard not to connect the dots, is this desanctification of sex that we have brought into our church and our psyches. Does damage to those relationships, and
Well, and I
not
think
just in
on
unmet expectations.
no, well, and on this one, where you're going with it, I think gets to the root of this. And I think what makes artificial intelligence so dangerous to this, and again, it's not one of these like, so run from the hills, throw your computer out the window, because it's like it's an inevitability. You can't get around it. But I think what makes it so dangerous and what makes this topic so important for people, whether you're guy, girl, like what, it doesn't matter,
Mhm.
is AI now allows a level of personalization that I think is going to expose how much this is a heart issue, not a, well, did you go this far? Did you do this
Right.
thing? Did you, because it's like, well, now that becomes so ubiquitous. It's like, well, now I actually think the adultery of the heart is actually going to be shown on full scale, because it's going to be like, well, anybody can personalize this to a degree of, and I think the risk we run is we start trying to put this into categories of, well, this is okay, but this isn't okay.
Mhm.
This is, if we do this, we can, and it's like, whoa, with AI, if your heart wants to go astray, it will be able to, in whatever way might look, culturally acceptable, even within the
Right.
church, like, oh, well, that's disgusting. I would never do those things. But I do have this companion app that kind of meets my emotional needs. And if this were a human being, anybody would say that is an emotional affair.
Oh yeah.
But because it's AI, it's like, it's not, it's not really a person. And you don't even realize that your heart is being led astray very subtly.
Yeah. Well, and I know, uh I can't remember the specific context, so I won't try to remember it. But there was a fear that someone had expressed about like a future husband, and this was, of course, before all this stuff. Porn was still a little bit more difficult, whatever, to get a hold of than it is by far and away today. And but even in the absence of all of that, um, she had heard a story about a husband who, like, they were still married, but he had essentially sexually abandoned his wife because it was too much work to please her compared to the work it took to please himself. And and that's just a pure low tech analog environment that's already a danger.
Yeah.
And historically, you know different people listening to this will have different levels of exposure to these specifics, but um in terms of how it's portrayed, but there's a lot of literature that's still in print and published that really puts the man's sexual pleasure at the center of a sexual relationship between a husband and wife.
Yep.
And and as long as that stays there, and as long as that mentality is still present and rampant, whether explicitly or implicitly, or implied or not, you know it almost makes it seem like it's okay for the guy to go explore other avenues if he doesn't feel like what he's getting from his wife is what he wants.
Yeah.
And um I and again, we're just I think at the heart of it, we're just talking about more and more accessible, but deeper and deeper in
It's going to
engagement.
start messing with us on a
Right.
psychological and spiritual level that I honestly think is never happened before. And again, I think it just goes back to this. I look at, let's use pornography as an example, because to me, it's one of the most destructive forces out there right now. Yet it's in many ways one of the most socially accepted, kind of like, well, like guys, whatever, or everybody. And it's like, what? But
Hmm.
it kind of reached that point where it was just kind of accepted as an okay thing. And I think the thing with AI is it exacerbates, it makes things that are strong stronger, and it makes things that are weak even weaker. And when I see where the church is today and the sexual ethic we have today, and how much we kind of avoid it or don't talk about it, or we kind of like, oh, let's kind of keep it in the shadows, it's like AI is going to exploit the living snot out of this. And the part that I think makes it even more dangerous is, especially in the early stages, there's going to be a shame and embarrassment
Hmm.
that goes along with it that is going to drive it into the shadows even further. Because,
Yeah.
well, it might be socially acceptable to come to a group and say, you know what, I'm struggling with pornography. Whatever. It might even be socially acceptable to say, hey, I kind of had an affair with my wife, or what. Saying like I fell into a intimate relationship with an AI bot, I think for a while is going to be this like,
Oh
whoa,
yeah.
taboo. Like we don't want to talk about. So that's going to mean people aren't going to want to bring this to the surface and go, hey, I just started experimenting with this. I was having these innocent conversations. All of a sudden it went sideways. And now I'm like hooked on this app that is feeding this seemingly hole. But now I don't even know where to go for it, because I feel like I'm just going to be
Oh yeah.
stigmatized if anybody knew that I was struggling with this. And I think the church is often not a safe place to come with some of this stuff, which is unfortunate. Going back to our conversations on community, it's not always the safest place to go, I'm really struggling with this, and this may seem weird and this may seem odd, but like, I just want help working through this. And I think that's actually going to make this even harder, which is why I think we need more awareness around it.
Yeah.
So people are like, hey, this is not this taboo, random, oh, yeah, only the extreme, you know, perverts, air quote, would ever dabble with this type of a thing. We need to go, hey, this is real. It's here. People are already struggling with it, and it's only going to get worse, because if we can destigmatize it, we can bring it into the light.
Yeah. Well, and it's the plight of the early adopter, because you have that person who feels, in 10 years from now, there's going to be people who still feel like they're the only one because no one else is talking about it.
For sure.
But when you are the only one in a group of, like 10 guys, because you're the only one who's found it, you're the first one in that specific group to fall on your face and go, oh gosh, how do I get out of this?
Yep.
Your desire for connection on the level of, I understand it because I did it. do you understand it at all? Like, can you, yeah, you get nervous because you're like, I've got to be one of the first people. And you look around, you're like, that guy definitely hasn't. That guy definitely hasn't. I don't know about that guy, but you don't want to ask them.
Right. You also don't want to ask.
You know?
And it's a very uncomfortable thing because, again, this is from a social standpoint, it's new territory,
Yeah. Yeah. And by the
which
time you
always
have
makes it.
time you have a critical mass in a community to form a ministry around it and get somebody to lead it and do all this stuff to make the safe place that should already exist, it's already too late.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, look at take pornography as an example. It had been wreaking havoc since the internet came. I mean, it was before, but I feel
Mhm.
like the internet just turned the volume on it up to 11, and then the mobile smartphone came out, and then the volume went to like 25. And that's been what, the iPhone 7 or iPhone 1 came out in 2007 or something like that. It's only in recent years that we've started seeing the catastrophic fallout of this
Yeah.
on people. And it's only now starting to get to a point where it's a little more socially acceptable for people to say, hey, this is an area I struggle with, or this is
Yeah.
a struggle that I've had. We're only getting to that point, and how many decades have passed
Oh,
before
yeah.
we got there? And so now we're on the verge of the next generation, which I think if the iPhone turned it up to 11 and the internet turned it up to 20, AI is
Yeah.
going to turn it up to 150. I
Oh,
mean, it's
yeah.
just going to crank the volume so loud. And I don't think people realize how significant.
Yeah. Well, and it's, you talking about, again, we're talking about kind of the march of technology. Um, I was reflecting recently, I can't remember exactly. There's a place that we pass pretty frequently that is being remodeled into shops, but it used to be an adult video store.
Okay.
And I remember, and there's more than one along a path, the road, but thinking, man, it's really cool to see these places closing down. And it wasn't until more recently, when I was thinking about it, where I thought, wait, it's not because they're not closing down because of some
The
great
demand is going
revival and
away.
thought process of it. It's
Yeah.
it's just like Blockbuster. It's not like people stopped watching movies when Blockbuster went out of
No, if
business.
anything, we consume more media entertainment than we
Right.
ever have in the history of
Yeah. I was like,
human
actually,
history.
I was like, wait a second. That's actually almost sad that it closed, because it's an indication of just how much, as we've said, how much easier it is to get to things without
Oh,
being
yeah.
noticed. You don't have to park your car and walk inside and see someone and wave and whatever. You
You
could
don't have
just
to sign up for a
y-
website.
yeah.
I mean, it's getting to the point where it's like you don't have to sign up for anything. You don't have to do
Mhm.
anything. And I think that's where like AI is only
Oh
going to make
yeah.
it worse because like you don't even have
Yeah.
to do it. You can create it yourself. Nobody even has to
Right.
make it for you. You just create
Yeah.
it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, and at some point someone's going to do the same thing I did with, portions of the porn industry, and like, look, it's being torn down. How great is it? And it's like, it's just further in the shadows.
Well, and that's, so like one of the things that again, it's not intended to freak people out about it,
Mhm.
but it's to make them more aware, one, so you can fortify the walls, so you can set up safeguards. And again, not to go, I just think about like with having 7 kids. You don't be like, all right, nobody has the internet, nobody has anything. We're gonna
Right.
put on your bonnet and go churn butter in the garage. Like we're not going to that extreme,
Well, that's
but
because
it's
you don't
one of
have
those
room in
like
your garage for it.
yeah, that is true. That is true. But it is this like, okay, hey, how do we make sure that we're protecting you from these? And I regularly talk with my kids about this stuff
Mhm.
so that they're discipled in this to go, hey, you need to be aware that these things are out here and they're competing for your attention and for good reasons. They're trying to tap into the way God wired you. He wants us to be intimate with other people. He wants to be in community with other things. He wired us to do this stuff. But Satan's going to go, all those rules that God gave you? Wouldn't you like to have all the good with none of the accountability? Come
Mhm.
on. I've got that fruit for you right here. And
Yeah.
it's, I think where the large language models are now, and then you see where things are going with extended reality and the Apple Vision Pro being out, these models now can create 3D environments. I mean, it's going to ramp up to a level where it's like you can create the
Yeah.
world you want to create. And we know from the Bible, when we create the world we want to create, it doesn't go well.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I know we've anchored in a couple points around image of God, community, condition of your heart. And I think the other one that we wanted to anchor people in a little bit, in terms of kind of the, what can we do? What are some places where we can very practically be combating these things? And one of the ones is the doctrine of grace, and just the idea that on the one hand, we do have the example of, in one of my favorite passages in Isaiah that I cannot remember chapter verse right now. I had it moments ago. It's gone. Where he talks, and it's in many of the prophets, where he says, I don't want your sacrifices. I want your obedience.
Yep.
And in the reading through the sacrificial system, there's a lot of, when you become aware of your sin, do this. And then for all the sins you never became aware of, here's what you can do.
Right.
Just, you missed something. Let's just acknowledge it.
Right.
Here's those.
Even on your best day, you miss something.
But it's all about the idea that if you're sinning, you're not initially aware of it because you're walking that closely with God, to the point where, in Isaiah, when he says, I don't want your sacrifices, and in other of those prophets, he's not saying sacrifices themselves are no good, but you're abusing the sacrifices. You were aware of your sin before you committed it, and now you're going to bring me a sacrifice as a way to make it all okay. Like, that's not what it was designed for. And I think there's a little bit of that imprints on our New Testament context, because in First John he talks about when we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins, and it carries with it, the whole, if you say you're without sin, you're kidding yourself, passages. And so that same idea of walking closely enough to the Lord, being helped in that through community and seeking out the fruits of the Spirit, those things help us in a good direction, so that if we're doing something and we're just doop-a-doop-a-doo, I've had a couple idiot moments on the internet where I'm like, oh, that looks like a fun thing in this ad. I click the ad and I go, oh shoot, that's not the rabbit hole I wanted. It's like, okay, now I know about it. I know better, do better. And sometimes I look at it after the fact and go, why did I ever even think that was safe? I was already like, something was going on here that was making me think that was okay. When I look at it now, I'm like, I don't even know why I thought that.
Yeah.
But I can take comfort in knowing that he is faithful and just to forgive me of that because of the relationship he has with me, I have with him. Rather, I said that backwards the first time. But like, we
Not
can
using
do
that
that
as a justification.
but we can't be getting to that place where we're saying that, the rhetorical question that Paul poses, do we go on sinning that grace may abound? Certainly not. Like, we're not here to abuse God's grace.
No.
And I think being in community, I mean, one of the things that we do, not that it's a magic bullet or I expect everything to be totally fine. But like, really, with Wyatt, like, image of God. Why do we treat people well? Why do we treat them with kindness? Why do we do these things? It's because we are all made in the image of God. And so we treat people in that way. And I think that is foundational, because it was a statement. I wasn't like, oh, what's that? When I started hearing it more as an adult, but I didn't grow up with it. And having that perspective in mind, like, it doesn't prevent me from sinning in all cases,
No.
but it reminds me of why my sin is significant
Yeah.
in
Well, and
these
I think,
areas.
and in that same thing, I know for me, one of the things that I talk with the kids a lot about as they're starting to mature in this is that, again, when it comes to the sexual piece,
Mhm.
sex is a good thing designed by God when performed within the bounds of his
Mhm.
good guidelines. And anything outside of that is a deviation from it. And so it's not this, it just helps them see, like, why does it matter type
Right.
of a thing. Again, not that it prevents any temptation or not that it prevents you from just being able to be immune to all this stuff, but it does help you go, okay. And then again, to your point, you have that thing that anchors you back to say, hey, hang on, how do I come back into this? But how do I not use that as a way of going, well, I'm going to do what I want because thank goodness God's going to forgive me. I mean, I just even think some of the things, and I think this is why talking more openly about it is actually one of the most beneficial things we can do. Because again, when things are in the shadows, man, the enemy can run
Mhm.
a heyday with it. But I just even think, as I went through things, it's been over a decade. But when I went through all this stuff, there were so many like misunderstandings I even had from my childhood that had been ingrained in me that were like, oh, wait, that's not true. Like, I won't explode down there if, like, and it was like, yeah, no, that's not the way God, and it was like, there were just so many things that I don't think culturally we realize get baked into our psyche that can lead us to inadvertently justifying things and going, oh, well, I'm doing this for this reason, or it's the ends justifying the means, instead of going, God doesn't operate like that. He doesn't say, well, I get you may not be getting things the way you want right now. So, you know what? If you need to do things to work around it, that's totally fine. So long as nobody's getting hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's yeah, you mentioned the lies we tell ourselves, and it's so easy to do. And I know when when I went through my struggle, I that was, one of the ways I tried to quote wean myself off was through and one of the biggest mistakes I made in the process was, okay, is I can't be looking at this. And so I started like reading stories, and oh my goodness, that was so much worse because now I could imagine people the way I wanted them, and now that was baked into my brain. um and I'm like, oh well, that didn't help at all. um
Yeah.
and and nothing really does. But it's like, okay, maybe I can wean myself off by doing this. Maybe I
Right.
can just focus on reducing it to this
X
many
X
incidents.
number of mistakes, or
Maybe
and,
I
and I
can.
think and I think that's where AI adds a new layer of
Yeah.
justification into the mix, because you can suddenly start personalizing it in a way that's like, well, I won't do this, but I'll kind of taper it
Yeah.
back from this and do this. And it's like, if your heart or mind is going here in any way, shape, or form, it is equally sinful. And so you can't, but again, AI is going to offer those substitutes in a way that they're going to seem very tempting.
Yeah.
They already do.
Yeah. Yeah. So i mean I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Hopefully somewhere in there, for people, is kind of an avenue of hope through, um looking at the future of technology and where that's going and some of the pitfalls, because I think they really are pitfalls, and we have something stronger than the world that lives within us as Christians. We have the Holy Spirit who teaches us, who helps us, that we can lean into for support. We have the community around us to lean into and say, and you know what, if you find someone and they're not safe, look for somebody else. Somebody is safe.
Yeah.
and um and bring that darkness, shine a light on it. um as long as we have Christ in our lives, indwelt with the Holy Spirit. God is sovereign. There's no reason to despair over
No.
what's going on around us.
No, and I think if anything, my hope through this conversation is that one, it draws light into the darkness, into something that would otherwise either be you're oblivious to it and it's happening around you and you aren't there to be that support. Because to your point, some of it is we need community, we need each other, and you can't be a support for someone else if you aren't even aware of what potentially they're struggling with. So I think creating greater awareness to it. And I'd love if we get to, even destigmatizing some of this stuff. So that it's like, hey, if this is something you're struggling with, if this is something that you're even starting to tread in the shallow end of the pool, talk to someone. Heck, we've got our email address. Like, geez, talk to us. I would rather see people have someone to talk to and say, I'm struggling with this and I don't want to go down this path, because it's gonna pull people sideways. And I think anything we can do to support each other as believers to help fortify our walls in this area. I don't want us 20 years from now to go, how did we miss this AI thing?
Right.
And we've now just the church looks exactly like the world with sexual ethics because AI has allowed it to do that. And I think this is just one way we can stay ahead of it.
Yeah. Agreed.
Well, with that, hopefully it challenges people who listened. Hopefully and again, we've got our future of church podcast at gmail.com. Feel free to send your thoughts, reactions over. I'd love to hear some of the stories or just, reactions to things as we go into it. I don't know if this will likely not be our only conversation on this topic, as I kind of continue following where the models are maturing. Because I think we're at different stages of it. Again, when OpenAI Sora came out with the text to video, I went, hey, we just crossed another threshold of temptation that is going to hit the world really quick. And we already have a lot, and it's only just begun. So I hope we can build some community around that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we will wrap this one up because this is a little longer than usual. And we will likely be back. Are we on for next week? I think we're on.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So for those of you who watch and listen, we're going to try and do this on a weekly basis. Sometimes we didn't get to it last week. We had some conflicts, but we're going to try and do that as best we can. So hopefully you found this conversation helpful, insightful, challenging, encouraging, whatever it is. And we will see you on the other side.